Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Performance Psychology Podcast. In today's episode, I'm interviewing Professor Rusty White, who is the Research Director of Clinical Psychology at the Queen's University Belfast. He's also considered a global mental health expert and also works with elite athletes in supporting their performance and mental well-being. In today's episode, we discuss his new book, which is looking through the lens of psychological flexibility and how we can better support athletes and how we balance mental health and performance. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Russ White to the Performance Psychology Podcast. A huge welcome and thank you for being on the show with us today, Russ.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for the invite.
So I'm really interested in today's conversation because it seems pretty topical given everything that we're starting to see within the world of sport and how mental health kind of issues are rising and becoming more and more discussed through areas like social media. So you've recently written a book which we're going to have a bit of a talk about as we go. But just first and foremostly, I'd probably like to start with this question. If we just have a quick perspective shift and just consider ourselves a sports person or an athlete listening in or watching this podcast today, what would you really hope that they could glean from the conversation that we're about to have?
Yeah, I would hope that people will relate to this reciprocal link that exists between well-being and performance. So to perform well, you have to feel well. And certainly whenever you're performing well, you tend to feel better in the aftermath of good performances. So yeah, that reciprocal link between feeling well and performing well. And also the idea that it is okay not to be okay, and for this to be part of the conversation that athletes have with those around them, support team members, family members, other athletes. And as you picked up on, it's great to see that conversation has really come to the fore, particularly in the context of the Olympic Games, but also with Naomi Osaka and her withdrawal from the French Open around media commitments and wanting to safeguard her mental health and well-being. So I hope that people will have a willingness and a courageous willingness to have those conversations and be open.
There still seems to be some kind of stickiness and taboo around those conversations. So obviously it's wonderful we're starting to see more and more athletes becoming a bit more open about struggles that they're having and how it's affecting performance. But the book you've written, what was the real kind of inspiration behind that? Is it trying to help to break down some of these barriers?
Yeah, it was recognizing that reciprocal link is there, and that sports psychology has done a great job at providing inroads for psychological work around performance. And I think there's also a need for mental health professionals to reach out and to liaise appropriately with those involved in sport to help to recognize the value that the work that they do can have for athletes and those involved more broadly in sport too. So we use this analogy of the pit crew in the book, and
like Formula One.
Yeah, exactly. So motorsport analogy, Formula One car, and we highlight the tire 1 at the front left, tire 2 at the front right. And if we think about tire 1 as being performance specific focus and the different professionals that are involved in helping to promote improved performance, it could be sports scientists, physiologists, it could be physiotherapists, it could be technical coaches, it could be sports psychologists, and they're working to ensure that tire is on and it's safe and it's good to go. And we think about tire 2 on the right, and there being opportunities for mental health practitioners to really tend to that tire and to ensure that it's fitted well, it's fit for purpose, and it's running. So that might be counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists like myself. it could be psychotherapists. And what I've noticed is that the language that the two parts of the pit crew have traditionally spoken have maybe been a bit different. So, for example, there's been a lot of attention on notions of mental toughness in performance psychology. That would be more traditionally a front left, Tier 1 focus. And mental toughness as a concept doesn't translate well into mental health and well-being practice.
Why is that?
I think concepts such as resilience or perhaps post-traumatic growth are more commonly used, and there would be concerns around the use of concepts such as mental toughness in a mental health setting by virtue of the concerns that might arise in some around the idea of being perceived as mentally weak, and how that could actually act as a barrier, that could prevent people from being open about the difficulties that they're experiencing. So I was really interested with my co-authors to think about, well, how do you ensure that the pit crew are working well together, that they find a common language, and that their efforts are coordinated so that you don't get drag on the car and the steering of it if one tire is not working particularly well. And we were really interested to think about psychological flexibility as a concept that has been used in sports and performance sector, particularly sports psychologists, with approaches such as MAC, and also mindfulness-based approaches more broadly, acceptance and commitment therapy work that's focused on performance. And also psychological flexibility is a very important mechanism of change for mental health practitioners as well. And there's been some good research evidence around the role that can play in helping to bring about improvements in people's mental health and well-being. So yeah, if psychological flexibility can facilitate that shared language, if it has application in both a performance setting and a mental health and well-being setting, we wanted to use the book as an opportunity to explore how acceptance and commitment approaches can be used to support well-being and performance.
So are you saying that there's or if you could define this for us, this would be wonderful, a difference between a rigid strength and a flexible strength? Like, how would you compare and contrast those two types of ideas?
Yeah, I was really interested with my co-authors to think about how thinking around mental toughness has developed over time. And initially, it was regarded as being a trait, so well established, not necessarily amenable to change in the short term. And then more recently, people like Bradford Cooper have been talking about functional mental toughness, which is more state-like. So it can shift and change in context. It's much more pliable than maybe historically notions of mental toughness have regarded it as such. So whenever I was looking at functional mental toughness, it really started to speak directly to notions of psychological flexibility. And we compare Bradford Cooper's model of functional mental toughness with the model for psychological flexibility. And we use the POD, as we call it, to help illustrate what psychological flexibility is. So P stands for present, O stands for open, and D stands for doing what matters. And that seemed to map on well to notions of functional mental toughness, but also I think provides some additional benefits as well, just in terms of promoting that mutual understanding between different types of professional, and also giving a pathway forward in terms of intervention. So the work on psychological flexibility that we have been doing really is applied. It's quite intervention focused, and we hoped that the book would be a great practitioner's guide for those interested in applying psychological flexibility in the context of sport. So I quite like your question around rigidity and flexibility and notions of malleability and pliability. And that makes sense for athletes, right? Because they're used to focusing a lot on physical agility and flexibility. And athletes get it whenever you start talking about being psychologically flexible. So can you have a broad range of behaviors that you can draw upon, that you can use to respond appropriately in the different situations that you find yourself in? Can you be present with the breadth of your experiences? Can you be open to allowing those experiences to be present? And can you do what matters? That really speaks to, well, what matters? What are your values, and how can you move
So
towards them?
rather than kind of applying this idea of mental toughness indiscriminately across the board, it's this kind of sense of being able to kind of notice the areas which it's more appropriate.
Yeah, that's right. And some of the conceptualizations of mental toughness, for example, the 7 C's that people talk about, there's a focus on control as one of those 7 C's. And we know that control is not always possible, right? That in spite of our best efforts, the context can be bigger than us. And I think psychological flexibility really speaks to how we can be with that uncertainty, how we can be with that precarity, how we can try to manage when the system seems much bigger than we are. Yeah.
So what is a good approach in that situation where an athlete or a sports person kind of, as best they can, because let's be honest, the control agenda has been, preached for a long time,
mm-hmm.
Within sports psychology. So what would be its, what would be a good addition or replacement of that idea?
Let's be very clear. We don't want to take away from the importance and value that control can bring. And in terms of marginal gains, we know that sticking to regimens and schedules, trying to limit the amount of load that athletes are placing on themselves, trying to control the controllables can absolutely have its role and its place. And you hear that quite a lot, right? People talk about, well, control the controllables. I'm really interested about what you do with the uncontrollables, right? So
could you give us an example?
Yeah, I think in terms of an event scenario or a competition setting, there are curveballs that can be presented in terms of weather conditions, for example, in terms of levels of fatigue that at times can be unpredictable, at times of uncertainty around the event itself and whether it's going to happen. Right? COVID-19 really demonstrated that. People preparing for 4-year cycles in some instances for an event to take place, and it's gone, right? Because of circumstances that are completely out with the control of the individual. And you could imagine how those different variables that I've just mentioned do have the potential to play on athletes' minds, and that has the capacity to take them out of the present moment, that it takes them into a space where they're trying to suppress, or in some instances get rid of, the difficult feelings that have arisen as a result of these uncontrollables happening, and that's to the detriment of their ability to trust their processes, to go in and to perform and to allow things to flow. So yeah, hopefully that captures some of the spirits of the uncontrollables that I'm talking about. And yeah, I think psychological flexibility has a big role to play, and it comes from the evidence base, really, in relation to acceptance and commitment therapy, for example, an intervention that focuses on psychological flexibility. The evidence base from mental health settings is that acceptance and commitment therapy can be really effective at helping to manage chronic pain, which...
Yeah, I've just seen it's been introduced to the NICE guidelines.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
As one of the first interventions, isn't it?
Right. So in spite of our best efforts to medically control pain, it can persist. And in particular, there are types of neurological, neuropathic pain that can be really intolerable and don't respond particularly well to efforts to treat it. So what do we do in that instance? In addition, acceptance and commitment therapy has also been applied in the context of complex mental health problems like psychosis, where people may have experiences that don't fit with the reality experienced by others around them. So, for example, hearing voices or having unusual, strong beliefs, and those can persist in spite of our best efforts to treat them. And again, there's growing evidence base for the efficacy of ACT and psychological flexibility as a mechanism to help people to be with those experiences, but to not have those experiences prevent them from doing what matters to them.
There's a wonderful film actually that's just popped into my head called A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe. That's essentially him as the brilliant mathematician, kind of based in America. Mm-hmm. I think he was an economist as well, who came up with some wonderful things. But mm-hmm. he essentially was experiencing psychosis, and this was back in the 70s, I guess, and they were trying to treat him and so on and so forth. And essentially, he took an ACT approach, an acceptance commitment therapy approach, before ACT was really ever a thing, and managed to achieve some wonderful things kind of with those experiences coming along for the ride. So it's that doesn't surprise me at all that it's being kind of applied in that area with some success.
I think that's a very important point, Trevor. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's that there are aspects of what ACT does that have been around, that are in great wisdom, right from ancient Greece to medieval French philosophers like Michel de Montaigne, for example, and some of the insights that they have provided around the nature of the mind are very much about what ACT is about, and the originators of ACT are very upfront about that, that what they're doing is bringing it together in a framework that can really help inform how practitioners work, and they're providing a justification through theory for the work that is being done. So it's an important point.
So it's kind of a sense of, all along, we kind of know better, mm-hmm. We can just get in our own ways with these, I suppose, rigid or kind of more toxic approaches that don't work out too well in the long run. Mm-hmm. Could you give us an example of how, if you take something from your book, how it's, really been useful to some of the, people, the population that you work with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we packaged the flexible mind approach, which if we think about ACT as being the engine that can drive psychological flexibility, I guess the flexible mind is our configuration of that engine. And we packaged the approach together in 7 sessions. Sessions as a term needs to be understood from the perspective that we're taking session as a block of work, and it can stretch across multiple meetings. And we do in the book provide some indicators when progression from that particular session might be merited. So at the end of each of the session focused chapters, we've got some pointers as to when there might be the level of progress and the insight for the next session to happen. And we were also very keen to ensure that the sessions were interchangeable. And that was really building on some of the insights and reflections that practitioners have had about other acceptance-based approaches that tended to be quite linear, had quite a focus on doing things sequentially. And, if we're going to be flexible in terms of the aspirations we have for our athletes, it's important that we're flexible as practitioners. So interchangeable, and it's formulation driven. It's about the practitioner and the athlete building up a shared understanding of what's going on, where the particular points of focus might be in terms of the work that's done. Is it on helping the athlete to be more present? because they're living in the past in terms of things that haven't necessarily gone their way, or they could be very concerned and anxious about the future and they're not really attending to the now. Is it that they're not particularly open, so they're trying desperately hard to push away those difficult thoughts that will nag around who they are, how they're doing, how other people see them? Are they really unwilling at the moment to make space for that? Or is it that they have an understanding of what matters, but they're not necessarily committing to actions that are consistent with those values? And we've all been there, right? We've all got stuck in particular patterns of behaving, and that might be governed by really trying to move away from what we don't want rather than moving towards proactively what it is that we do want. So yeah, the book does talk practitioners through that process of assessment and formulation, which is so important then for setting the scene for the work that gets done. So I hope that that section of the book on assessment and formulation is helpful. But yeah, we do take the pod apart a little and focus in on each of those three aspects: being present, being open, and doing what matters. So again, I hope that that's useful for practitioners. For me, the most important thing, and the bit that I really quite enjoyed of all of it, was thinking about how you help support practitioners in the work that they're doing with their athletes to help the athlete to move flexibly between those different parts of psychological flexibility. How is it that you help to highlight the fact that psychological flexibility is greater than the sum of its parts? And whenever I was learning ACT as an early therapist, I was very mechanical. I guess you might recognize this, Trevor, in terms of you learning new strategies and techniques, right? You kind of go to the manual and you pick the manual off the shelf and you think, okay, I reckon in my work today, I'm going to try to see if I can be bold, be courageous, and bring this element of the work into my interaction with the client. And that
with a kind of a forced
exactly right. So it's a kind of,
I will be flexible.
Yeah, but I'll focus on this element of flexibility today. And you can see
flexible, yeah.
Yes, exactly. You can see what the function of that might be. It's about giving you practice. It's about developing competencies. But is that necessarily consistent with the important work that you're doing with the client and the function that work is meant to be serving? And we use this analogy of the triathlon, right? So you start the triathlon with the swim. At the end of the swim, there's no medals handed out. Nobody bounces out of the swim and gets presented with the medal at that point, nor do they get presented with that at the end of the cycle, nor at the end of the run. It's putting it all together, right? It's at the end of the competition. And it's a bit of a cliche, but there is obviously an element of truth in this about triathlons are won in the transitions. Okay, so it's that transitioning from the swim into the bike, then transitioning into the run. And it's about, well, in psychological flexibility, can we transition between the focus on being present into being open, into doing what matters? If I'm doing a bit of work with a client on doing what matters, how can I transition to help the focus be allocated as well to being on present and then into being open? Do you see what I mean? That
yes.
If psychological flexibility is greater than its parts, it can feel a bit academic sometimes when you're working with an athlete and you're helping them to be present. The athlete can be within their rights to say, great, you've got me being present with this stuff. Where to now? Oh, yeah, that's for next week. And it kind of feels contrived, right? It feels not necessarily in the service of psychological flexibility. So there is an element in the book where we use questions to help highlight how practitioners can be flexible in moving around the pod, and how that can really serve to bring the richness of psychological flexibility to the fore. So an example of that, just off the top of my head, I might have been doing a little bit of work to help the client to get in contact with some of the difficult feelings that go alongside their emotions. So it might be helping them to sit with the physical sensations that go along with those difficult emotions. And I might then say to them, which is focusing on the being present piece, I might say to them, now that we have been able to support you to be present with that difficult emotion and the feelings that go alongside it, and I applaud you for your willingness to do that and to go there with me today. What might that now afford us in terms of you being able to commit to doing what matters? So it's that flexibly moving, if you like, between the elements of the pod. So I hope that that's helpful and that it does really illustrate the spirit of what psychological flexibility, flexible mind approach is about.
It's really interesting the link between a more general, if you like, outside of sport sense of well-being, and how that relates and connects to performance itself. And I can definitely see this idea of, we don't just have to practice being flexible here within the sporting arena. You've got all these other opportunities to practice in the rest of your life. I certainly know, for one, I sense the most rigidity that I experience outside of sport is with the wife. So it's this sense of how practicing being more flexible and attending to the now, and certainly sitting with or being in the presence of uncomfortable thoughts and feelings that I want to argue my way out of. For the most part, I'm probably wrong, but how the mind gets going, and how that's then useful as I practice flexibility over here, that I can then apply this to my sporting performance when I'm under the cosh or behind the gun in competition, and things start showing up that I find pretty uncomfortable. The ability to, if you like, having practice letting them go over here is now useful for me over in this area as well. And historically, has there been this big, gap and divide between these two areas? And you feel this book is a contribution to try and, bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think it's an important point, and people need to be careful not to have the focus so much on developing the athlete that they forget to develop the person.
Yeah.
People need to be broad in their approach so that they are supporting the athlete and they're supporting the person. And that generalizability piece, I think, is what the book is speaking to. That, yes, it's about helping those practitioners who are very much focused on the sporting arena, and also those who have perhaps had a remit that's focused more broadly, if you like, on day-to-day living, and allowing them to come together. I'm really interested in this concept of daily stressors, and a lot of the research that I do in my work at university focuses on global mental health, which is about trying to help address inequities in mental health provision across the globe. And unfortunately, historically, very small proportions of money have been allocated to combating mental health difficulties in low resource settings, so low and middle income countries, for example. So global mental health is concerned with trying to address that inequity. And I'm really interested in evaluating scalable forms of psychological intervention that can get to broad numbers of people when resources might be limited. So I do a lot of work with refugees and asylum seekers. And one of the concepts that has really come to the fore in recent years is this idea of daily stressors. So historically, there has been recognition that index traumatic events, for example, experiences of persecution or torture or war-related, conflict-related events can impact on people's mental health and well-beings. And unfortunately, refugees are, by virtue of their experiences, at an increased likelihood of experiencing those kind of index traumatic events. But there's also now greater recognition given to the sense of precarity, uncertainty that people live with day to day. And that could be about financial concerns, that could be about wondering and worrying where other family members are. That might be about the level of treatment that they're receiving from the communities that they've been dispersed into. So any stigmatizing attitudes or ways in which people have been marginalized or excluded by the host population. So you get a sense of daily stressors, right?
Yeah.
And what I'm really interested in is daily stressors in the lives of athletes as well. And I hear this from the athletes that I work with. Yeah, there's a lot that can be happening in sport that impacts on mental health and well-being, but there's a lot of stuff outside of sport as well. And there's been some research that has shown that the cumulative life stress, so the number of stressful life events that athletes have, correlates very strongly with their level of mental health and also their level of mental health disorders. So there's this negative relationship. So the fewer difficult life events, the fewer the amount of stressors that people have been subject to, the better their mental health, i.e. well-being. But also if there's a high number of cumulative life stressors, then that seems to equate to worse levels of mental difficulties, mental health symptoms like levels of depression, levels of anxiety.
Yeah. It's kind of fascinating, obviously, how widely that research and how broadly it can be applied to so many different populations, right? Yeah. You know, athletes included. Just in finishing up today, if you could first just kind of briefly summarize like how the book's been pieced together, and kind of who your readership, you'd like your readership to be. Who is it ideally kind of aimed at?
Great. So I'll start with the second part of the question. Yeah, the book is aimed at practitioners. Practitioners we're using broadly to be those who are involved in sport and have concern around performance and or mental health and well-being. In the book, we talk about the practitioners who are there to put the flexible mind approach into practice as having some form of postgraduate qualification in psychology. And that could be an applied form of psychology, for example, sports psychology, educational psychology, counseling psychology, clinical psychology. And that's in recognition that there are psychological processes in play. We're also emphasizing the importance of good supervision in the application of that work. So the book as a resource, yeah, hopefully it's helpful, but it's a starter for 10. And it's about people getting ongoing support and them developing their understanding of the mechanisms. In terms of how the book was pieced together, yeah, we really wanted to bridge well-being and performance, as I mentioned earlier. And we were also interested to try to, if you like, invoke some skeptical voices. And we have some characters that we feature in the book that are intended, if you like, to be food for thought, almost to be anticipating how some people in the context in which the practitioners are working might be likely to react. So, for example, there's Dinosaur Dave, and Dave is the cynical, long in the tooth type coach that some of us might know. And then there's Meteor Megan. And Meteor Megan, if you like, is the research evidence that just like the meteor destroyed the world of the dinosaurs,
Okay.
hopefully Meteor Megan can help to dispel some of the cynicism that Dinosaur Dave brings. So yeah, we wanted to take the book beyond just text and to bring it alive through the voices of the characters that we were using. So there's also Helpful Henry, which points people towards audiovisual resources that really back up some of the key points that we're making. So we hope that that's useful. We also coined this new concept, and again, it's maybe not anything particularly new, but it is drawing renewed attention to this area, and we're calling it Wexcellence. And Wexcellence is a portmanteau. That might be, that was a new word for me, portmanteau. And a portmanteau is the combination of two existing words to create a new one.
Okay.
So Wexcellence brings together well-being, and excellence. And we're using Wexcellence as an opportunity to shine a light on this disposition that allows for an optimal balance between well-being and performance. Because we know all too well that you can have an imbalance there, that people try so desperately hard to perform better, and that it is at the sacrifice of their well-being, their mental health and well-being in the longer term. So if you like, this Wexcellence is the coming together of performance-related psychology factors and then also mental health and well-being. And we've Venn diagrammed that out to help highlight the space that we're talking about. So I'm really interested to move forward and to explore that concept further and to find ways of measuring it, because I think that's going to be important for us.
And I think just intuitively people get a sense of this intrinsic link between these two things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's wonderful that obviously this your contribution and things are the ball starting to roll. In terms
Mm-hmm.
of making it a bit more tangible and exploring mechanisms and the systems that are going to create real change. But forever we've seen performers and particularly golfers, from my point of view, who have the golfer has his first child,
mm-hmm.
and he's been playing really poorly, has his first child, and then he wins an event, or he plays
mm-hmm.
really well.
Mm-hmm.
It's there's there's been no change in the coaching staff, there's been no swing, there's been no technical change, there's been
mm-hmm.
kind of where's the performance come from other than these other aspects, that kind of well-being part. All of
mm-hmm.
a sudden they've had a big lift over here, and it's moved across into performance. And I think people kind of understand that intuitively, but for one reason or another haven't necessarily given its due attention.
Yeah, I think the perspective shift that can come with those kind of life events that you're mentioning, and the sense of greater balance across different life domains. We see that in elite sports, and absolutely we see it in other occupations as well, that when life events happen that allow for some greater balance across the life range, then you start to see shifts and changes. So yeah, that's the area that I'm really interested to explore and understand better.
And there is one interesting kind of thing that's just popped into my mind, actually, that it's not just when they've had this so-called positive look.
Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes right. Also when they've lost a family member or a coach, and then performances, all of a sudden they're playing in their memory, and that's inspired performance. And that's an interesting take, because obviously ACT is very strong on all thoughts and feelings mm-hmm. are all part of the human experience, and they all come along for the ride. And it's not necessarily what could show up and look like, well, this is a really negative thing and it's going to negatively impact performance. Actually, what we've witnessed is that that's just not the case. It's how it functions.
Right. And it's the meaning making that people have around that experience, and the opportunities that provides for helping people to explore what really matters. And in ACT, we talk a lot about values and people's values, and those are are specific to the individual. You know, it's great that ACT provides a technology that helps us to explore what values really matter to the individual. And again, that's something we touch on in the book. And we have a website with audio recordings that go alongside the book and help to illustrate how practitioners can work with athletes to better understand those values through the exercises. So hopefully that's going to be useful. But yeah, even in our pain, we can understand our values, because our distress, our upset provides a window of opportunity to understand what it is that sits on the other side of that, what it is that matters. If it wasn't important, you wouldn't worry about it. So the fact that you're worried about it indicates that there's something close by that is important. So yeah, difficult life experiences are a very important element of the work that we will do with athletes. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Ross, it sounds like it's going to be a wonderful resource, and certainly one that I'm going to be delving into. So thank you again for your time today. And yeah, wonderful conversation. Thank you.